Hi everyone, my name is Sohab Mahmood. I am from the California Department of Housing and Community Development. This is the Housing Laws and Policies section of the Reported Planning Commissioners Training. I will be providing an overview of some of the different state laws that have been passed over the last couple of years, some of the technical assistance we have available to help jurisdictions pass these state laws, and to kind of give you an overview of housing in California. So first, we're going to kind of go into why it's important to talk about housing and especially affordable housing and kind of the state of housing in California. I think we've all heard in some way or another that we're in a housing crisis, but a lot of jurisdictions sometimes ask, what does that mean? What does that look like? And so these are some numbers, I guess, to help support or help contextualize when we talk about housing and certainly housing affordability in California. And just for reference, when we talk about affordable housing or what is affordable housing, it really is just housing that is considered affordable to households, which is usually known as no more than 30% of one's income being spent on housing costs. So it is generally considered that and these numbers are a result of if you think about if somebody is has affordable rent or is living in some type of affordable housing, it generally just means that that person does not have to pay any more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And a little bit of context for that, the 30% of income on housing costs is a standard that's used both in the private and the public sector, where it's kind of determined that 30% is usually a healthy number that people should be spending on housing costs and no more than that. And so that 70% of their income can go to other important expenses, including healthcare, utilities, food, educational expenses, transportation, and things of that sort. And so right now, if we look at that standard of no more than 30% of your income going to housing costs, and we look at a minimum wage worker, a full-time minimum wage worker as an example of that. Right now, a minimum wage worker is making $15 an hour. This slide was made a while ago before the $15 an hour came into effect. So we're going to use around roughly $14 to $15 an hour. And so for a minimum wage worker who's making anywhere between $14 and $15 an hour, an affordable rent means that they're spending, again, no more than 30% of their income on housing, which means that they're spending no more than $728 a month on housing. And I mean, if you just think about it, where in California or how many apartments or any type of housing is available for $728 a month if you don't have a roommate situation or some other sort of situation. Another example is that even if you are paying $728 a month, or you're able to find a unit that costs that much, how many of those units are actually habitable and safe to live in, and also in neighborhoods where you have access to opportunities such as transportation and jobs. And so that also gets into certain situations where people have to live much further away than their jobs because that's where they can find a relatively affordable rent. Additionally, right now, as a reference, you'll see the two lines on the slide. You'll see that the average one-bedroom apartment is a little over $1,600. So you can only afford, as a minimum wage worker, $700 a month, yet the average one bedroom in California is $1,600. So already right there, a minimum wage worker, as an example, would be cost burdened, almost severely cost burdened. They're paying close to double what they should be on rent. And that's already straining their budgets and straining their lives, right? It limits the amount of money that they can spend on transportation, on health care, on any educational expenses, on food, on a variety of things. And another reference is that right now, a two-bedroom apartment, the average two-bedroom apartment in California is $2,000. We also know that this number varies a lot city by city, region by region. For some jurisdictions, it might be like, yeah, that's pretty typical, $1,600. For for other regions and cities, it's kind of like you kind of laugh at it, like there's no apartment available for anything less than $1,600, if not way above. There are some markets that it's at minimum $2,000 for a one-bedroom apartment. And so you already see that an example of a full-time minimum wage worker is always going to have in California that struggle to access affordable housing. Another example you'll see on the slide is the second blue graph, where it says affordable rent at the bottom. I know it's a little small. It says affordable rent for a household at 30% of AMI. 30% of AMI is roughly a household that is lower income. And so if you're a household, right, this means multiple people, you also can only afford about $700. And if you are a household of more than one person, you're probably not, it's not going to be super suitable for you to be living in a one bedroom, and you're going to need to look into living in a 2 or 3 bedroom. And as you can see, the average rate for a 2 bedroom is $2,000. The average rent for a 3 bedroom on this slide is $2,700. So way almost triple what you need to afford rent in California. Another example you'll see on the third bar graph, because a lot of people do say, well, not everyone's minimum wage. There are a lot of moderate and high income earners in California, and that is true. And so we look at right now in California, the average renter wage, meaning the average renter makes about $25 an hour as their wage. So yes, definitely above the minimum wage. So given that the average renter makes about $25 an hour, we use that number to calculate what is typically, what can they afford as the typical renter in California. And so the typical renter who's making $25 an hour can afford, on that third line, $1,200 a month. It's still lower than the average rent for a 1 bedroom and much lower than the average rent for a 2 bedroom. Also, again, what this doesn't take into account is regional markets. Again, I would still sit here and say, like, in the Bay Area, where could you find an apartment that rents for $1,200 a month? And that is the typical renter who's making about $25 a month. So you can see across the board, households are struggling to find an apartment that falls within that 30% of what is a healthy, affordable rent for them to be spending money on. Another example here is on the slide. You'll notice 45% of households in California are renters. That means half of our population, close to half, rents. And that underscores not only the importance of affordable housing, but the importance of housing in general for our population types and those who are living in California. Here's an example now of housing production numbers in California. This is really an example of, what kind of housing shortage are we talking about? Again, we hear a lot about the housing crisis. We don't have enough housing. We don't have enough affordable housing. We don't have enough housing in the right places. And so this is an example of, the blue graph represents what we need on an annual basis to meet the 6-cycle RHNA. RHNA stands for the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and the 6-cycle RHNA is roughly, for the entire state put together, about 2.5 million units. So this represents, on an annual basis, the blue line represents how much we need to meet that number over an 8-year period. The green represents what we have done on an annual basis. So here's the 2020 numbers for the lower income RHNA. It represents that just for 2020 alone, again, just for that 1 year, we are significantly short of what we needed to build for just that 1 year alone. And so if you think about if that trend will project forward for the next 8 years, we will significantly struggle to meet our housing needs for this cycle as we've done for previous cycles as well. So this slide was really to go over the affordability challenges of renters, but also just people in general living in California. This slide really underscores overall the production or the lack of production that we have in California when it comes to meeting our housing needs. So a lot of people do ask, what happened or what is happening? Why don't we have enough housing? What are the contributing factors to why we don't have enough housing? Why don't families have access to the right type of housing they need? How do we ultimately end up in a housing shortage? And before we get into the contributing factors, and there are a lot of reasons why production has not kept pace with California's populations and changing demographics, it's also important to recognize who are the players and who are the people involved when it comes to planning, building, and developing housing. And so generally you have local governments, right? And includes many people in local government, staff, planning commissioners, elected officials, city council members who plan for housing. They do long range planning for housing through their housing elements, for example, their general plans. They process housing projects, applications, and then they ultimately are in charge of approving housing. So it's important to note that that the decision lies on the local governments to approve that housing. Second, developers are generally, they propose the housing, they acquire the sites, they design for the housing given a jurisdiction's regulations and standards, and they help acquire the financing to fund the housing that's being built, especially for affordable housing. And in this relationship, there are a lot of areas in the past couple decades that a lot of research supports where it notes where housing has been held up in the process. And oftentimes we've seen in this research and in the general consensus is housing, when it comes to making sure that housing gets built, there's quite a bit of barriers that exist when it comes to processing and approving housing projects, and to ultimately get to the outcome of building that project and making those units available to people. And so local governments have a huge role in making sure or helping to assist housing from getting approved and built. And ultimately, a project, for it to get built, everyone has to play their part in the relationship, in this relationship of getting it built. And so another example of this is when local governments, an example for affordable housing is to finance affordable housing. Most of the time, a developer or an applicant needs to apply to multiple state and federal funding sources, or just multiple funding sources in general, often public funding sources, to put the funding together to make sure a project can pencil out. And in their process of applying for multiple funding sources, there are certain dates that they have to adhere to because those funding sources are extremely competitive. And so there have been many situations where a jurisdiction or an applicant will apply for funding and tentatively be approved to receive that funding, upwards in millions of dollars, to make their project pencil out. But at the same time, they project that they'll get certain approvals at the local level in a certain time frame. But unfortunately, in the past, because of certain uncertainties that happen at the local government level, that projection will be pushed out quite a bit. And oftentimes a developer could get approved and granted funding, again, upwards in the millions of dollars within the first 6 months of a project, but yet that project isn't being approved for 2, sometimes 3 years out. And oftentimes what we've seen and heard and the general consensus is that there's a lot of delays in processing a project, but also a lot of back and forth and not really having clarity on what that project needs to do or have to be approved, right? So every time we're requesting design changes to a project and we're requiring a developer to attend more than 5 hearings. That adds time to a project and ultimately adds time for those units to get built and for people to be placed in housing. Oftentimes when you're subjecting a project to multiple planning or multiple hearings without any clarity on what it actually needs to do, that back and forth takes time. When there are projects that are being requested, significant design changes, that can impact the feasibility of a project. When a project, maybe 6 to 9 months in the process, are being requested to change the levels of affordability, that can impact the financial feasibility of a project. And ultimately, all of these things we've seen is that a project can very well fall apart, and they have, because, and with that being fallen apart and they lose their funding, it ultimately results in not getting the units that we need that are very much needed for every community in California. And so a lot of, we kind of went into some of the contributing factors, but generally what we've seen is that there have been many factors that played a role in California not keeping pace with and building at the levels that we need, and certainly at the affordabilities that we need. One was certainly community opposition at the local level and other parts of the state, where communities and organizations had enough power and strength to come together and ultimately make a project either very difficult from getting approved or not being approved at all. Another area that was a significant contributing factor to the delay in housing and getting built was local entitlements and processes. And there are many things the state has done to strengthen or to help local governments address those issues. The planning grants that we mentioned earlier, SB2 and LEAP and even REAP, are efforts, are money that was available to local governments to start updating their internal processes to help process projects in a much more expedited timeline, in a much more streamlined way. State laws that you'll hear about a little bit today, SB 35 is an example, the Housing Crisis Act, SB 330, the Housing Accountability Act. These laws were either put in place or strengthened to again address some of the delays and some of the timelines that happen when you're talking about the local entitlement and the local entitlement process. Another contributing factor was just insufficient zoning for housing, especially housing that for the housing types that we need, which isn't just single family homes, but also variety of housing types, including multifamily, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, ADUs, known as accessory dwelling units. And so again, several state laws and efforts have come in the last couple of years to help address that issue and kind of address it from the state side, including housing elements and the strengthening the laws around housing elements, which also has called, and the high arenas, which have also called for jurisdictions to rezone more to allow for more housing in their communities, planning grants to help support local governments in updating their housing elements and completing their rezones to ultimately, again, provide that zoning for housing. Various state laws that encourage and require that certain types of housing are permitted in jurisdictions. SB 9, which is known for duplexes and sometimes triplexes. SB 10, accessory dwelling units, which I'm sure everyone has heard quite a bit of in the last couple days. Hannah, can we take a break? And so another contributing factor to not having enough housing, enough affordable housing, and also necessarily not having housing in the right places and locations was historical patterns of segregation and exclusion in how we zoned and how we planned for housing. You'd see jurisdictions where you would have majority of the multifamily housing and affordable housing in one part of the city, that maybe have not have access to the same resources and opportunities as single family neighborhoods in another part of the city. And so to address that, or one of the ways that that is being addressed is through the strengthening of permanently furthering fair housing in California, also known as AB 686. And that's something that most jurisdictions have seen quite a bit, especially in their housing element. And lastly, there is a recognition too that there have been financial limitations to providing the housing that we need, and at the state and the federal level. And so there have been a lot of strategies to help address those limitations, including significantly increased funding for affordable housing, but also standardizing, especially HCD's affordable housing financing programs so that they better align with one another. So efforts include using one application to apply for multiple programs to make it easier and even more streamlined for developers to access money or access funding from various funding sources. So I think, lastly, to kind of tie this all together, if it hasn't already been said, why is it important for us to really look at the housing crisis at, especially both at the state and the local level, and take action? And definitely we see that in those numbers that we shared earlier, that people can't afford housing. They can't afford the type of housing that they need, or they can't afford housing in the right locations that are appropriate for them. And that we also just lack the number of units that are needed to support our populations and our demographics. But also, there'll be a situation where at some point we won't have the housing that we need, not only for our current generation, but our future generations. And so many, I think, of our children and our grandchildren and our families and friends will struggle to access the housing that they need, and it will continue to play on future generations of California. Another factor here is that putting housing in areas further away from jobs can make it very challenging to address our climate goals, right? Because then that has increased, and we've seen increased commute times and increased people in their cars having to travel from one place or another to get to their jobs and then get home, because that's the only place that they can afford the housing. And last, another thing is that people, because of the high cost of housing, they have to choose between paying for healthy food and accessing healthcare services and accessing transportation and keeping a roof over their head. And nobody should have to choose between what basic essential that they should have to pay for. And lastly, the lack of housing that is affordable is one of the leading cause for persons experiencing homelessness. And so our ability to meet this moment and to build housing and build it in the right places, and to also address the affordability levels, will help us provide housing for our future generations, help us address our climate goals, and also help us can contribute to reducing the number of people who are experiencing homelessness. I'll kind of skip over this slide and we'll come back to it later. So we kind of went over what has caused and what has contributed to the state of housing in California. And now we kind of want to go over, so how can we address some of these issues that we've talked about? And how could you, as local governments, leverage state tools and laws to address things at the local level? And so the first thing I'll go over, which I'm sure that by now most local governments have heard of, is one tool or one strategy that is required, but also a tool that can be used at the local level to address some of these issues, is the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process. So the RHNA is assigned to every single jurisdiction across the state. It's a projected number of units that we will need that's based on housing growth for lower, moderate, and above moderate income categories. that a city must plan and zone for in their housing elements. So the state estimates how many housing units is needed for an 8-year period. Generally, it's an 8-year period. There are some parts of the state where it's a 5-year period. We often will call this the planning period or the RHNA cycle. So for reference, right now most jurisdictions are in, if not all jurisdictions are in the sixth cycle, the sixth cycle. And again, that will last for most of the state for 8 years, but for some jurisdictions or some parts of the state, that's a 5-year period. And that estimate of number of units we're going to need for a certain cycle is based on various factors, including population growth and household size and age. And then that number is divvied out to each regional government. So often a regional government known as an MPO, metropolitan organization, or a COG of that region. That COG or MPO or that region will then, with a group of jurisdictions and working with the jurisdictions, divvy up that regional allocation, again, based on a variety of factors to each local government. And then each local government, again, will be assigned a RHNA. Once that RHNA is assigned, it usually triggers at some point the housing element update. And so a local government will update their housing element to do, among other things, identify strategies and sites and effort to accommodate that RHNA allocation. It's important to note that RHNA is not a prediction of development. It does not represent a ceiling of production, and it is not limited to the availability of land, capacity, or growth controls, meaning oftentimes rezoning is necessary to fully accommodate the RHNA. The RHNA is a number that we use to plan for housing in California based on certain factors. Once a RHNA again is assigned, again, a local government, which most local governments right now in California are doing, will work to update their housing element to again identify the different strategies, often through land and other efforts to accommodate that RHNA. So I mentioned a couple times that the RHNA is identified, or the RHNA is, there's various factors that go into determining what the RHNA will be. One of those factors, there are many statutory, the factors that we use to determine the RHNA are also statutory objectives. Again, this is in state law. The government code is listed at the bottom of this slide. And the different statutory objectives we need to achieve or we need to use to address the RHNA include increasing housing supply, but also increasing different housing types and affordability in an equitable manner. Often that references and goes back to how we implement AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing. We also need, as part of the statutory objectives, is to look at how we're promoting other state planning priorities, including infill development, protecting our environmental and agricultural resources, and promoting efficient development patterns. Also, as part of assigning the RHNA, we're looking at, and regions are looking at, job housing balance and balancing the RHNA, putting lower income RHNA in higher income areas and vice versa to, again, create much more equitable communities. And biggest piece is making sure that when RHNA is signed, it's done so in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. So next we'll talk about the housing element, which is another effort that a local government will take and should take to accelerate housing production, but comply with state law, and can also help address our housing goals and help us meet our housing goals. So just a little bit of background, a housing element is a required element of the general plan. Most jurisdictions, again, if not already, will start updating their housing elements for the sixth cycle to accommodate the sixth cycle RHNA. Housing elements can often lay the framework and the foundation for housing to occur in their community. It includes when, where, and how housing will or could occur for all income levels. Housing elements and the RHNA doesn't just cover very low and lower income categories. It also covers moderate and above moderate. So it covers all income categories. And again, the housing element helps determine possibly and identify strategies for where that housing could or should occur and how it could occur. Housing element is very important. The compliance of housing element is very important to access several state funding sources and incentive programs. Without a compliant housing element, a jurisdiction can struggle to access state funding sources, both housing funding sources as well as transportation funding sources, and can face potentially financial penalties and be very vulnerable to litigation. It is a legal planning document that plans for housing, including, and it includes an inventory of land to accommodate the RHNA. It includes reviewing and addressing constraints, governmental constraints at the local level related to how we process and develop housing. And it also includes a plan on how the city is going to address many of these issues and a plan on how to affirmatively further for housing. Eventually, the housing element gets adopted or will get adopted by the city council or county board of supervisors as part of a local government's general plan. There are very detailed laws and guidance on what goes into each section of a housing element. And so all 539 cities and counties are required to update their housing element when that time comes. It's also important to note, and I'm sure you've heard this a lot, in the last 2 to 3 years, the legislature has taken a lot of efforts to strengthen housing element law and housing element compliance, knowing and acknowledging that this can be a very important document when it comes to setting the foundation for housing to occur in our communities. Also, HCD has been given authority to monitor compliance and refer violations of housing element law, as well as other housing laws, to the Attorney General's office. Also, without a compliant housing element, like I mentioned, you could face financial penalties by courts, and jurisdictions could be vulnerable to litigation from various organizations, including housing rights organizations, developers, and HCD. So another effort we would want to discuss today is the variety of housing types that you could allow in your jurisdiction and the different state laws that could be leveraged and help govern how to allow these different housing types in your jurisdiction. So the first one is SB 10, which was passed in 2021. Excuse me. SB 10 allows jurisdictions to adopt ordinances that'll allow for up to 10 units on certain parcels and be exempt from CEQA. So the exemption from CEQA is really important because it allows for a much more streamlined way for a jurisdiction and ministerial process for a jurisdiction or a developer to have 10 units on certain types of parcels. So as we mentioned, the CEQA exemption can streamline and allow for more housing. Sometimes this law or this type of policy can be considered missing middle or lower density housing. It can help achieve many goals that were addressed in this presentation, including allowing for more affordable housing choices, including missing middle type housing, and providing for more zoning options beyond the standard multifamily and single family zoning. So SB 10 is something that if you want more information, we have the government code listed here, and you could always also contact your city attorneys to provide more information on how SB 10 might apply for your jurisdiction and how you could implement SB 10. Another one is SB 9. So SB 9 is another tool that local governments can use to provide more housing choices and options. I do want to emphasize that these are state laws, and jurisdictions do need to comply with state laws. However, a jurisdiction can proactively address some of these state laws and encourage the use of these state laws in their jurisdictions. So SB 9 can help facilitate the creation of up to 4 units on a typical single family lot. It requires a ministerial review, meaning no discretion or subjectivity in judgment, including limited to no public hearings when an SB 9 project is proposed. SB 9 can help address some constraints and common hurdles that developments will face. Because, for example, through a ministerial process and no public hearings, it can limit community opposition to this type of project. It also can help address historical segregation that we discussed by creating more inclusive communities through allowing more housing choices in single-family neighborhoods. Lastly, SB 9 does have some effect and play into ADU laws. In general, they're known to complement one another, but we do have resources on HCD's website about SB 9 and its relationship to ADUs. Ultimately, SB 9 requires the ministerial approval of a housing development with no more than 2 primary units in a single-family home, or the subdivision of a parcel in a single-family zone to 2 parcels, or both of those things. Again, I would recommend taking a look at our website for more information on SB 9. Another example of state laws that have been strengthened that we've seen been leveraged at the local level to make it more easier to do and implement state laws with ADUs, so accessory dwelling units. Sometimes ADUs are referred to as granny flats or in-law units. Sometimes they're even referred to as backyard cottages or secondary units. But ADUs have been found to be a very innovative and effective affordable housing option and provide much needed housing in California. They provide several benefits, including creating more inclusive communities, by providing affordable housing types in typically single-family neighborhoods. It also ultimately can help increase the supply of housing and address affordability issues. In the last couple years, there have been several laws that have been passed to remove barriers to building ADUs, including a more streamlined process and expanding where ADUs can be permitted. So this slide is actually a little outdated. It references laws from 2021, but every year we find that the legislature is strengthening ADU laws. So I do recommend always keeping up to date with our website, where we try to stay up to provide updated information on ADUs and other topics when new laws are passed. But generally, things that are really important for you to know about ADUs is that they must be allowed in all zones that allow for residential uses. So that includes not just single family zones, but if you have zones, any zone that allows for residential, including mixed use zones, multifamily, that ADUs must be allowed. Different state laws also reduce and modify fees and parking requirements for ADUs. They require the ministerial approval, including a building permit. And ADUs generally, single-family lots, you could have one ADU, and one JADU, also known as a junior accessory dwelling unit. Again, on our website, we do have ADU technical assistance guidance available to help kind of answer any nuanced questions with ADUs in your jurisdiction. So next type of housing that state law governs, but also is an important type of housing at the local level and throughout California, is transitional and supportive housing. So state law does require that transitional and supportive housing be considered a residential use and only subject to those restrictions that apply to other types of residential use. So oftentimes, transitional and supportive housing have been subjected to pretty highly discretionary processes because of community opposition or because of the fear of those who are going to live in those housing types. And the goal is transitional and supportive housing is focused on providing mostly housing to those who are or exiting homelessness, but also it provides housing to other types of populations, including persons with disabilities. And so it's important to recognize that this is a very valuable source of housing for local governments across California, and it provides housing to those who are some of the most vulnerable in our population, including those who are experiencing homelessness, those with mental health issues, and those who have disabilities. And so that's why it was important for state law to come in and recognize that this is still a residential use, and it needs to be treated as such as you would treat any other residential uses. Specifically, transitional housing helps people move or transition from experiencing homelessness to more permanent housing. And supportive housing provides permanent housing to people who were experiencing homelessness, and it includes wraparound services to support that individual. So again, like we mentioned, it must be allowed as a residential use and only subject to those restrictions that apply to other residential uses. So for example, if a transitional or supportive housing project comes in like a multifamily housing project in a specific zone, it must be treated like a multifamily housing project would be treated in that zone. And ultimately, it is to limit anyone from treating housing type any differently than they would other housing types simply because of the population that might be living in that housing project. And so another thing that was strengthened through state law, strengthened supportive housing specifically, was AB 2162, which also requires that supportive housing be considered by right in zones where multifamily and mixed uses are permitted, including any non-residential zones that are permitting multifamily uses. So supportive housing that meets certain criteria under AB 2162 must be allowed by right in certain zones. Some other things, so we talked a lot about different laws that govern different housing types, right? ADUs, SB 9, SB 10, supportive housing, transitional housing. Again, these are all housing types that under state law you need to allow in your jurisdiction, but also provide a very valuable source of not only affordable housing, but housing options in general. Now we'll kind of go into different laws that govern how you process and you look at certain housing types, or how you just process housing in general. So one law that's been in place for a couple years now is known as SB 35, which is generally referred to as a streamlining piece of law. And so what SB 35 is for is that for jurisdictions who have not permitted enough housing to meet their RHNA allocation during the housing element planning, during the housing element cycle, are required to provide a streamlined ministerial approval process for certain types of developments that meet specific criteria under SB 35. So basically what it's just saying is that, hey, as a jurisdiction, if you haven't built a certain amount of your RHNA, then you have to provide a easier option for certain types of projects to get built. And that's a streamlined ministerial process. Now, it's important to note that these projects who would like to take advantage of SB 35 also have to meet very specific criteria within this law. From a local government, though, your responsibility is to make sure you offer the process and adhere to the process if a project were to meet the specific criteria. We also have quite a bit of guidance on SB 35 on our website as well. And so SB 35 is one of those tools that can be used to streamline projects and to reduce any type of discretion that might be used in approving a project. SB 35 can apply to different types of projects. They generally have some level of affordability, though, as part of the projects. Another state law that was certainly strengthened as well in the last couple of years is SB 330. SB 330 has a lot of provisions to it, but I will go over just the one that gets at the streamlining idea. and the idea of processing projects in a timely manner. And of the SB 35 process, one is that, or SB 35 law, one is that jurisdictions are only allowed to have 5 hearings on a proposed housing development to render a decision. So you cannot have, it ultimately limits the number of public hearings you can have on a housing project, especially when they're complying with all the applicable zoning regulations. So the goal with this law is really to, again, streamline and expedite the process, but also provide certainty to developers during the approval process. So no more than 5 hearings for a project. Another thing about SB 330 is that, again, you must render a decision on projects, whether they be approved or disapproved, 90 days after the certification of the EIR, or 60 days if a project includes at least 49% of the units to be affordable. Here is a slide on other provisions of SB 330. Like I mentioned, there's quite a bit in it, and so we won't go through everything. You could also go to our website to find out more information. But generally, other parts of SB 330 include you generally cannot downzone in your jurisdiction unless you are concurrently or offsetting that downzoning by increasing in another part of your jurisdiction or another parcel. You cannot impose or enforce design standards that are adopted after 2020 that are not objective. You cannot enforce any type of moratorium without ACD approval. You cannot impose or place any growth caps or limits on the number of approvals or housing units that can get built in your jurisdiction. Generally, no population caps, and there are replacement requirements for housing that is being demolished. So generally, if a housing unit is being demolished, especially for a certain affordability level, you do need to replace that unit at a roughly 1-to-1 ratio. Again, these laws, there's a lot of in between in these laws and different nuances with each provision. And so I do recommend or encourage you to keep these laws in mind. Do look on our website for any information, but also work with your city attorneys if you feel like you might be coming up against any of these provisions. So that kind of wraps up the housing laws and policy section of this presentation, the technical pieces. Again, we talked about a lot of laws that are state laws are required, but can be leveraged to really allow for these various housing types and affordability at the local level. And we also talked about certain provisions that are in place to help expedite and streamline the approval process to ultimately get housing built and help housing get built in a streamlined way, in an efficient way, so that we can have more people live in housing units that are affordable, are in the right locations, and that are habitable units. And as part of the presentation, there are a lot of things that are available to jurisdictions, including tools and incentives to help comply with housing law, but also to accelerate housing production. So the first incentive that's available to local governments is the pro-housing program. And the pro-housing program is ultimately a program that rewards jurisdictions for doing the right thing and also encourages jurisdictions to really go above and beyond state law and become pro-housing. We accept applications on a rolling basis. We also have a lot of technical assistance, so feel free to reach out to the team, and we have contact info after this, or you can reach out to me directly. And the pro-housing program, once you get designated, or if you get designated pro-housing, there are a lot of benefits to the program, including access to receiving additional scoring points and preference to various very competitive housing and transportation funding programs. Another thing to consider too is that, through a lot of these tools and the funding that we talked about, including SB2 and LEAP and even REAP, and the strengthening of these laws, and a lot of the efforts that HCD has and throughout the state to help local governments comply, it also is important that we're all holding each other accountable to complying with state law and to doing our part in addressing the housing crisis. And so for that, one of the things that HCD has is strengthened enforcement authority over the last couple years to use its authority to help jurisdictions to enforce state laws, a lot of which we've talked about today, and help enforce state laws. And so our authority helps us we can take a variety of actions, including investigating complaints about compliance with housing laws in general, providing technical assistance to help jurisdictions comply with various housing laws, letters of correction to help give local jurisdictions the assistance and the time and guidance needed to comply with these laws, and sometimes when needed, taking much more firmer actions, including ultimately referring violations to the Attorney General's office. So with that being said, it's definitely important you make sure that you're at least complying with state laws, not just housing element laws, but state housing laws. And, hopefully that, another thing to keep in mind is we know most jurisdictions are working on it and working very hard on getting their compliant housing or their housing element in compliance. However, without a compliant housing element, there are a lot of issues that can come up. One of them is an inadequate general plan, losing access or struggling to access various state incentives, including funding and programs. So for example, you would not be able to access the pro-housing program if you did not have a compliant housing element, potential lawsuits, loss of permitting authority, and possibly financial penalties. And so our unit, our department, also helps enforce several of the housing laws that we talked about today, but we also provide significant amount of technical assistance and tools and resources to local governments to help comply with these housing laws. And many examples we talked about today, the Planning Commissioner's Handbook, you could read about these different laws in more detail. We have a lot of different guidance documents available on HCD's website if you have questions about these state housing laws, or you could always contact one of our team members and we could hopefully help you work through some of the issues that are coming up if you're having or struggling to comply with certain housing laws. So I do just want to go over again, we mentioned the Planning Commissioner Handbook as one tool available for you. It does summarize or include a description of all the housing laws that we went over today, plus more actually, and it includes content on other issues that you run into that also relate to housing, including CEQA, community engagement, financing, and legal issues that you might run into as a planning commissioner and also on housing. Other tools that are available to you, again, like we discussed in the beginning, the Housing Planning Hub site, which is hopefully a statewide tool where you can access various resources that are available to local governments, including model ordinances and toolkits on different housing policies. ILG, under this technical assistance program, has a housing and public engagement toolkit. The statewide housing plan on HCD's website includes a lot of the data and information that we provided in this presentation today. And there is a housing element video that you could watch and also use to help engage the community and the public when updating your housing element. And here are also a bunch of other additional statewide resources that are available to you, including OPRs, resources, information on CEQA, information on just being a planning commissioner. We have a lot of housing guidance and information on different housing laws on HCD's website. And so if you ever need good reading material, you can click on any one of these links and get some good information on different topic areas that we discussed in this training series. Well, with that, thank you for listening and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or anything comes up. Thank you.